Hey everybody, what's happening? Well, we got a nice long video for you today here. Probably just audio only, podcast style, I guess. And it's going to be ranking every book I read this year. I read 32 books this year, which for me is probably the most I've ever read, so that's really cool. Um, I know some folks read like 500 books a year, which is kind of a crazy concept to me, but more power to you. And I read mostly good books this year, which is great. I mean, I know it's like kind of fun to shit on these the crappier books, but I really read a lot of good stuff and stuff that I really want to talk about. And I have talked about a lot of these books on my channel and done reviews, but some of them I haven't. So we'll just go through everything. I'll go from worst to best and give you a little bit of a description about it. There's just some great stuff I read this year. I think probably this was my best year for reading ever, not just in terms of the amount that I read, but the quality of content. Just some excellent, excellent stories. So, yeah, let's get started. We'll start with the worst books. And there were no books this year that would, this is all a 5-star rating, basically. Nothing 1 star. I'd say we'll start with 2 stars because I didn't read anything that was atrocious this year, thankfully. So let's get started. All right, let's start with the worst books of the year. There's really only two 2-star books on here, which is not too bad. The first book, which, and these are in no particular order necessarily, I'll let you know if they are, is The Descent by Jeff Long, which I think came out in 1998. This is kind of like a horror, action adventure, kind of dark fantasy. It blends a lot of genres together. It's basically a book about we discover that there's this massive cave system underground, humongous cave system that spans the entire Earth. It goes down even deeper than our oceans do. And they're filled with these demon-like creatures called Hadals, which is basically the basis for all of our religious sort of theories and the idea of Satan and hell. And they basically send people down there to cross the cave system underneath the ocean and check it out. And a lot of other stuff goes on. This book has an amazing opening chapter, and if you look this book up, you're probably going to see a lot of the same stuff I'm saying, that it has what people feel. It has a very great horror opening chapter, and the book kind of falls apart. The opening chapter of this book is basically the movie The Descent. If you've seen the movie The Descent, this opening chapter is pretty much the same thing. This book is, the movie The Descent is not a movie version of this book, and as a matter of fact, I believe that Jeff Long sued the filmmakers because of how close it was, and I'd have to say that there's some validity to that, because I really enjoy that movie. The movie about I think it's a group of Australian women or British women that go down in a cave system and get trapped, and there's some creatures down there. There are scenes in this opening chapter that are like beat for beat from the movie, so they definitely ripped him off, but the opening chapter is about 50 pages, and I highly recommend reading it. It is an excellent book, excellent short story, and as a matter of fact, I feel like this all started as a short story because it is so concise and wonderful, and it is written very well. So I recommend checking this book out just for that first chapter. It is really excellent. If the rest of the book was on par with that opening chapter, this would probably be one of the best books I read this year. It's very scary. And it's just written really well. The book kind of just falls apart after that. It changes gears and turns more into this pandemic style story. The next 100 pages of the book are a lot of world building, and this is a multiple POV book, so it sets up the characters, and it can get a little boring, though. I liked the shift in direction. I liked what Long was doing. I thought the world building was cool, and I can get kind of nerdy with this stuff, and I'm like, oh, if they're going to get really detailed with how these Hadals work and everything, go more of like a sci-fi dark fantasy route, I'm down for that. But after that, basically, once they get people down in the cave system and start doing this thing, it turns into like a Jules Verne adventure book, which also is cool. And I will say, there are adventure-esque moments in this book that are fun. But the problem with this book is that the writing is terribly inconsistent. There are so many plot lines in this book. That's my biggest problem. I've never read a book with this many plot lines and ideas. Long obviously tried to shove everything and the kitchen sink in this book, and it doesn't work. There are a lot of plot lines that don't need to be here, that are forced and just aren't written well. There are plot lines that are like brought up and solved on the next page, and it makes you wonder why they were even brought up. It just gets absolutely ridiculous by the end, and the book just falls apart into a mess. It's like he didn't really know how to finish the book and how to wrap everything up. It just gets way out of hand and crazy. And the writing is very inconsistent. I think in general, the dialogue in this book is not great. It's like a step below an action film. And a lot of the scenes in this book and a lot of the plot lines are on that par too, like a bad action movie or something. So unfortunately, it ends up not being a great book. Not even a mediocre book. It's pretty poor most of the time for me. I probably wouldn't read any more Jeff Long, and I probably wouldn't read this book again. There's a sequel to this book it might be called Deeper. I don't have an interest in reading that. I would perhaps read the opening chapter again just because it is great. I have to give credit where credit's due. I don't know. I mean, folks do, it's like people do like action movies and they know they're terrible, but they're fun. So I think this book might work for some folks. I know it does. But for me, it really was a mess. And it is quite a long book at about 600 pages. So at the end, it felt a little bit like I wasted my time. And that's just why it's going way down here. But yeah, that's The Descent by Jeff Long. The next book on this list in the 2-star rating is a book called Waif by Samantha Kolesnik. I've seen Kolesnik's name come up in the horror indie sphere, and people recommend her quite a bit, I see. So I decided to check out Waif, and it was pretty bad, I have to say, unfortunately. It's a novella, so it's about 90 pages or so, but Waif is basically like a body horror crime thriller. It's another one of those genre-bending books, and it's kind of more like a mess, I'd say. It's basically about a woman in a troubled marriage or relationship that falls smitten with some hunky man at a grocery store and kind of convinces her husband to undergo this like plastic surgery thing to look like him, and of course it goes wrong. And when I started reading this, I thought, oh, hell yeah, some body horror. I love me some David Cronenberg. Maybe this is going to get real gross and crazy, and it's going to be a fun read. And it goes crazy. It just never knows what it wants to be. It turns into a crime thing. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but this book feels like it was AI generated at times, and I don't mean to be disparaging to the author. It's fairly well written. The writing is okay for the most part. It's serviceable, certainly better than the Descent overall, but it feels legitimately like a book that has no direction, and you can't tell where it's going. Sometimes that's good. In this case, it's bad. The characters, like the whole beginning section with the body horror is basically thrown out the window, and then the character becomes like a prostitute in this crime ring thing, and the book is just a mess. It's an absolute mess. It made no sense to me. I know that it had a particular message it was trying to say, and I saw that message, but the execution of the book was very, very messy, and it never had any sort of direction it felt like it needed to be going in, and nothing that happened was really making sense at all, really. The characters' motivations and the plot points never made really any sense to me. So, unfortunately, it was a pretty rough book overall, but thankfully it was only 90 pages. I know folks like Kolesnik. I'm not exactly sure everything she's written. I know she's written another pretty popular one, but I would perhaps check out the other stuff, but this one was pretty rough, so I don't know. Anyways, those are the only 2-star books. We're going to get into more of the mediocre books now, which still didn't really do it for me, but had a little bit more going for them. All right, let's get into the 3-star reads. One of them is actually quite surprising, but let's start with A Headful of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. Paul Tremblay's kind of hit or miss, I think, for a lot of people. Some folks really like him as more of like a horror literature author. Folks don't tend to like him because he can be very, very ambiguous. And I'm kind of in the middle, although I'd say I'd lean more towards not really caring for him too much. I've read Disappearance at Devil's Rock. I read A Headful of Ghosts, and I've read The Pallbearers Club. We'll get to The Pallbearers Club, but Disappearance at Devil's Rock was pretty good. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't amazing, but I really liked it. I have a pretty long review of it on my channel. Headful of Ghosts did not do it for me, and I think people like this one a lot. I see this as one of his more popular ones. To me, this was like his least ambiguous novel that I've read of his. And although I do have a problem with his ambiguity sometimes and the way that he uses it as a crutch, I feel, this one, man, it was just not very good. I don't think that I like this author very much. He writes these horror adjacent novels where it almost feels like he's trying to write like Shirley Jackson style stories, but they feel like they're geared towards a younger, more modern audience. And at times, his books, although they're clearly intended to be in that horror literature sort of vein, they almost have like a young adult feel to them. I can't quite explain it. I just don't think they always hit. Headful of Ghosts is about like, it's basically The Exorcist. It's a girl that is perhaps possessed by a demon, and the twist in this one is that they allow a like reality TV show to film everything. And so in some ways I was like, this could be really cool because, you know, the reality of the situation, like that this girl's not possessed by a demon and is just has a psychological issue. And then what is portrayed on television is the like demon being, you know, possessing her. I could see that sort of dichotomy there, and it kind of does that a little bit, but not really. And it's like Tremblay has this issue, and this is probably just my biggest issue with him and why I didn't really care for this, is he doesn't treat his audience with respect a lot of the times. And what I mean by that is he over-explains things. You know, when you read something in his books that you think is kind of cool and ambiguous, and the amount of ambiguity that I like in a book, he goes and then outright explains what he just said to you, and it's kind of pandering. And in this book, it's done all over the place. There are these like blog-style posts that basically are thinly veiled explanations of what you just read, and I'm not down with that. He did it in another book of his, Devil's Rock, which I did enjoy, but there were times when he would just straight up explain something to you, and it felt so expository, it was hard to get past. So I can't say this book's not terrible, and I know a lot of folks like it, but for me it was just, I don't know, it just was really boring. I didn't finish this, and I do feel that way about all of his books, even Devil's Rock, which I do like, but I feel not a lot from it. It doesn't really do much for me. It doesn't move me. It's just like, that was okay. I guess I read that. So that's why Headful of Ghosts is going on here. I mean, I'm glad I read it, because I know it's one of his more popular ones, but it didn't really do it for me. The next book on this list is another Tremblay book, Paul Bearer's Club. Like I just mentioned, I might as well put it next, right? Paul Bearer's Club is definitely, I liked more than Headful of Ghosts just because it was more creative. It's basically like a guy who is writing a memoir about his life, and he's hanging out with this sort of kind of like punk chick, and he kind of thinks she might be a vampire. And he's also going through some problems. That's basically the gist of it. And much in the vein of Tremblay, it's horror adjacent, really. It's more like a thriller with slight horror elements, and it's very ambiguous at times, sometimes frustratingly so. The cool thing in this is, as it's presented as a memoir, there are writings in the margin from an editor that you'll see. You'll get more context for that as you read it. It's written in red letter, red ink in my version. And the writings in the margin comment on the actual text, and at times you start to have a different story unfold from that. So I liked that aspect that he went with. I thought it was very creative, and I liked it. I enjoyed that aspect of it. And at times, especially near the end of the book, the writings in the margin and compared to the main body of the text started to some really cool things happening. I really appreciated. But again, like the bulk of the story was just business as usual for me, for Paul Tremblay. It's just kind of a book that is like very thin and has a few maybe weird, ambiguous moments, but not much comes of it. And you're like, wow, that was cool. Not that I'm expecting this to turn into a full-blown paranormal sort of story, but it just feels like the exciting moments in this book that you're waiting for are so minimal. And they're so ambiguous, and you always feel, at least when I say you, I mean me, I always feel with his books like I'm just waiting for the cool thing to happen, and it never happens. So yeah, I'm not probably going to read any more of this guy's books. I don't think that they're terrible. I don't think he's a terrible author, but they just don't really do it for me. So that's Paul Bearer's Club. The last 3-star book we have here is probably kind of surprising. It's Stephen Graham Jones, who is one of my favorite horror authors, but it's Don't Fear the Reaper, and it's the second book in the, I think it's called is it the Angel Lake trilogy or the Indian Lake trilogy? I'm not sure the name. I've read The Only Good Indians. That book was phenomenal. I also read My Heart is a Chainsaw, the first book in the series, which I really enjoyed. I didn't like it as much, but I really enjoyed it. It was his weird take on a slasher. It was extraordinarily meta and had a million references. I thought he did a really good job with it. Jones is an extremely gifted writer, and Don't Fear the Reaper is very well written. At times it's confusing, but that's kind of how he writes. But he's absolutely superb from a technical standpoint, and he has his own particular style that I enjoy. That's why I like him. This book felt like it didn't need to exist. On one hand, I know a lot of people preferred this book because it was more action-oriented than the first one, so you do get into the thick of things a lot quicker, but it felt very meandering compared to the first one. Jade is not a main character. Well, she is a main character, but this book has multiple POVs, so it takes away from Jade as a character. That I really enjoyed her. I thought she was like a kind of a pain in the ass character, which I liked, and she was just kind of cool. I dug her, and we don't spend as much time with her here, and we spend time with characters that I didn't really care for as much. And it feels to me reading this like My Heart as a Chainsaw was probably supposed to just be a one-off book. In fact, I think it was. I think Jones had mentioned that that was kind of the case. So now this is going to be a 3-part trilogy, and I don't think that the second part really warranted it. And there were times where I just felt like this was totally meandering, and there were scenes in it that were really just there to fill out the time thing. So it's not a terrible book. It is, I would say, it's par for the course for Graham Jones in terms of the technical writing ability. It's very, very high level writing, but it was just kind of boring to me, frankly. So I didn't really care for this at all, and I found it a bit of a slog to get through at the end. Maybe that's a little more controversial because I know folks really like Stephen Graham Jones, but I'm not super excited for the third book, and I've said this before, I'm just ready for him to finish this so he can get on to writing other stuff, doing more one-off writing. So, yeah. Let's get on to the 4 stars, getting into the good stuff. These are the books that I really enjoyed. They didn't make it up there with the best of the best, but they're damn good books I'd recommend to you. The first book on this 4-star list is Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. I just purchased earlier this year a Kurt Vonnegut collection by Library of America, and it's his writings from 63 to 73. So it has Cat's Cradle, it has Breakfast of Champions. I can't think of the other ones, but the big ones are on there. And so I never read Vonnegut at all, so I started with Cat's Cradle. And I really enjoyed this story. It was really funny and extraordinarily satirical, and it's so insanely zany at all times, and I see the Mark Twain influence in Vonnegut's writing. Just a master humorist. This book is really, really funny. This book is pretty much completely plotless, and it's kind of postmodern in the way it's presented as like a story within a story, kind of. And it's very short. I think it was only like 150 pages. No, it might have even been like 90 pages. It was a really quick read. It was really good. It was really funny. It didn't, it wasn't like up there with the best of the best, but I really enjoyed it, and it made me want to read more Vonnegut, which I have quite a bit to read. I have about 900 pages more of him in this book, and there's about 4 other collections of him. So this was a great starting point for me, and I think this would probably be a great starting point for people of reading him, just because it's wacky and weird and gets you into his style, but it's not like it's a very difficult book to read or anything like that. It's not some very highly experimental book. His writing is not particularly confusing. Vonnegut is clearly a technically gifted writer who uses his power to make you laugh and think about things, and I really appreciated that. So Cat's Cradle was a great book. It's going on the list as 4 stars. The next 4-star book is Inherent Vice by Thomas Pynchon. I have a review of this as well on my channel. I've also read Crying of Lot 49. I found this one to be a lot easier to read. It's a later Pynchon book. This came out in 2009, whereas I think 49 came out in the 60s. This was a really fun book. This was a psychedelic, noirish sort of detective story in California in the 70s. It had all the vibes of that time period. It was very, very stylized to that. And you had 3 things going on that were great, that worked together. You had this hippie psychedelic, drug-induced sort of like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas style sort of psychedelia, characters going on acid trips and stuff. You also had this heavy noir influence. It felt like the golden age of movies with these shadowy noir elements to it. And then you just had a good detective story. It was extremely confusing at times. It was intentionally confusing. Pynchon was playing around with this sort of genre by introducing so many goddamn characters that you can't keep track of them. I just loved what he was doing. But throughout all of that, there is a good mystery story in here. It all makes sense. It's just written to be funny and confusing, and it makes fun of the genre, and it shows love to the genre. And I just loved it, and Doc was a great character. I've also seen the movie, and I think the movie is excellent too. I really think that Paul Thomas Anderson did a superb job with this book, and I think, he's one of my favorite directors, so I think anything Pynchon writes is probably in good hands with him. There's some rumors that he's working on a Vineland movie. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, it's in good hands. I think the movie's actually less funny than the book. Joaquin Phoenix is great as Doc, and the movie is hilarious at times. And there's parts that are even funnier. That Martin Short plays the dentist in this movie, and he's just. I was in tears watching this film. But the book at times is even funnier overall. It's just so funny, and there are moments. Not to plug my this is on my channel, but to plug my own video. If you watch my review, I read a quote from the book that stuck out to me. It is absolutely beautiful in the way he describes this noirish setting at night with rain pattering on the windows and the rain and the wind moving the trees. It's written so beautifully. So you do have moments of pure beauty in this book. This book's totally not for everybody, like I mentioned in my review. It'd be hard for me to recommend this to a lot of folks I know because it's so out there and weird, but that's Pynchon. And I think this is probably more of his accessible stuff than something like Gravity's Rainbow or something like that. Probably this and Bleeding Edge and maybe like Against the Day, although I know that book's probably more complicated because it's longer, but I feel his newer stuff is probably more accessible if you wanted to get into him, so... I loved this, and it was a really fun read, and I'll definitely read it again. Another 4-star read is a book called The Broom of the System by David Foster Wallace, who, of course, is most popular for Infinite Jest, and probably Consider the Lobster. That one tends to be pretty popular. Wow, this was really good. This was his first novel, and he wrote it, I think, as part of his master's thesis. I think he had a double major in philosophy and writing. I'm not exactly sure, but this was a very wacky book. It was like about a character named Lenore Beadsman whose grandmother breaks out of a nursing home with 24 other people, and there are just a lot of plot lines running through here. This is like the postmodern book of the time period. 87 was when it came out, and it is just full of... It is a totally plotless book. It is super postmodern. It is very layered and dense. It plays around with different styles every chapter. Some chapters are presented as transcripts. Some are in first, second, third person perspective. He's very much playing around with the art of storytelling, and there's very much a love of story in here. And there's a lot of philosophy in the book, too, which at times is a bit heavy-handed, though he did go back and say he didn't really care for this book and would have changed things. And, he did write it at the age of 24. But I still think it's a very good book and a very good read. And the thing with this book is it's just so funny. There's so many funny characters, and the way he sets up jokes is, to me, very postmodern, and the way that they sometimes take pages and pages and pages to land. I mean, you can have a joke set up and 150 pages later the joke lands. So overall, this was a really, really funny book. I think this is probably a great place to start with him because the book can be a little obtuse at times and hard to parse through, especially when it gets a little heavy-handed with the philosophy stuff he's going for. But if you go into this not expecting a cohesive plot that makes perfect sense and runs through, the book is really funny. It's just so hilarious. Legitimately one of the funniest books I've read. And like I was mentioning, Cat's Cradle was so funny, and it's how it was very satirical. Different styles of books. I found this to be funnier, and I would say this was one of the funniest books I read this year. So I definitely recommend checking this out. I know it's not as popular as his other stuff, but it's definitely worth a read for sure. Another 4-star book on the list is the book called Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which is like a weird fiction kind of cerebral horror book. Some people say sci-fi. I don't really think so. Some of the setting, I guess, is science fiction-esque, but it's about a group of people that go in as a surveying team to this weird place called Group X that is kind of like almost in a way like a nature preserve that is kind of expanding, and they're not even sure how they're getting there or what's going on. This book is very, very dreamy and weird and cerebral. You never ever have a grasp on what's happening or why it's happening or what's going on. You do feel lost at times reading this. And the book is also written not even in a dreamy style, which is, I think, the biggest turnoff for some folks. Is the book has the feel-wise is very dreamy and surreal, but the text is very cold and clinical. And none of the characters are named here; they're only named by their professions. And the character that we follow is very clinical in the way she describes everything, and that can be a bit odd with the very surreal, weird fiction elements. But this book started out, I felt like, oh, I see what's going on, but it's okay. It's very slow. It's a book that you just kind of have to sit with and enjoy the ride. But as it kept going, I kept liking it more and more, because as this book goes on, you get into the weird fiction elements start coming out. It starts even pushing very much so into a cosmic horror thing. And there are just some moments in here that are just cosmic horror chef's kiss moments. I felt like really freaking cool, weird stuff, and it made me uncomfortable at times. It's not like horrifying to me, but there were definitely some things that he put in here, some creature stuff that was like really freaky. And cosmic horror stuff, when it's done well, always amps up the scare factor for me, because it preys on existentialism, which is definitely a scary thing to sit and think about, right? One of the most freaky things that we as humans can sit and think about. It's one of those, oh, that's interesting to think about. Okay, I don't want to think about that too much. That's kind of freaky. So I really like this. This is super, super not for everybody. It's very stylized book. It's slow and pondering and cerebral and weird, but I really enjoyed it. It's extremely ambiguous about things, and that can be a crutch, like I've mentioned before, but I kind of felt like it was handled pretty well here. I know that there's 2 sequels to this. I don't think this is a book that needs a sequel. I thought it was a pretty solid little novella. I think it was 195 pages, so it's quite a quick read. But yeah, I'd be interested in checking out the sequels. There's a movie of this too, but it's not really the same. I mean, it's similar, but it's a decent action sci-fi movie with some horror elements. It actually is pretty good, but it's not really the same. They took the idea of the book and ran with it, as a lot of movies do. But yeah, Annihilation, one at the beginning, like I said, I wouldn't have put it as a 4-star read, but I really like it. And I've thought about Annihilation a lot. There's a couple books on this list that I just always find myself thinking about, and that's always a good sign, I think. So I really recommend Annihilation, that you check it out if you're into something like that. The next 4-star read, and there's actually quite a bit of 4-star reads on this book, it's where most of the ratings are, is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I've never read Austen, and I was kind of going through a period earlier this year where I was reading a lot of classics that I've never gotten to, and I really have enjoyed all of them. Pride and Prejudice was really fun. I think you all know the plot of Pride and Prejudice. It's kind of like the OG, like Marriage Story kind of thing, and the thing I was not prepared for was how satirical this book is, and how Austen's irony is often lost on people because of, how specific it is to that time period. And I think this book was written in this came out in like 1810, around that time period, but Austen started writing it in the early 1790s. As a matter of fact, I think it might have been 1791 when she started the first drafts of this. So it's definitely a bit hard to read at times, language-wise. I read some more later 1800s books, and I didn't really have a problem. I did struggle with the language a bit in here, and also one of the things is this book is very dialogue heavy, very, very, very dialogue heavy, and these older novels, the sentence structures are definitely longer than more modern sentence structure that are shorter. So her sentences are very, very long with a lot of commas, almost you could say a run-on sentence. And it creates this effect, I feel, at least for me, where it's like by the time you've gotten to the end of the sentence, you kind of almost forgot what the beginning of the sentence were because you're also trying to read through this older language and figure out what she's saying. So that was a bit of a struggle for me that I didn't think I was going to have. But this book is really funny. I mean, it is to me, yeah, some of the satire I'm sure was lost on me, but from a surface value, I found it to be absolutely hilarious. I didn't think I was going to have as good of a time with this as I did. And I don't tend to go for romantic stuff. It's definitely a romantic. Nowadays, I would call this a romantic comedy. And after I read this, I went and I watched the film, the one with like Keira Knightley or whatever, and I really liked it. I didn't think I would ever like something like that. Definitely not my style. And I thought that the movie did a great job at capturing the humor of the book, which I had no clue it would do. I think the book was actually more funny than the film. But if you've never seen the movie Pride and Prejudice and you're thinking, oh, it's just a romantic movie, I'm not interested, it's quite funny. Specifically, the main character's mother, who is just really hilarious. There's so many great characters in this book, but this was a great read, and I would definitely go on and read Austen's other work. So yeah, Pride and Prejudice was great. The next 4-star read on this book is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I read the 1818 text. I'm not sure if that's the first version or the second. I think it's the first. I think the second version is from the 1830s. I'm not sure. But anyways, this is a classic book that I've never read, and I just felt like, oh, well, I got to read it. And it's great. And as a matter of fact, I wouldn't even call this a horror novel. Some people say it's a science fiction novel. To me, it's like a dark tragedy. It's very philosophical. You know, Dracula is going to be on this list, which we'll get to. Surprise. But that's more of a like balls to the walls horror novel as compared to this. And this is not as accessible, I think, as Dracula, the different time periods. But this was a book that was very different than what I was expecting. It's very different than the Frankenstein. Well, of course, the image, but the idea and story of Frankenstein that I think we all have collectively in our minds. This is very different than that. It takes a very different route. And I know, you know, Shelley wrote this when she was 19 or so. The writing in here is superb. Definitely a different language used, so it's a little hard to judge it like that, but it is a very technically excellent book. And it can be dry to read now, I have to say. Like, it is a lot of dialogue and long philosophical discussions, so a lot of it is kind of like that. To me, it's more like a philosophical piece than it is like a complete story, but it is still a good story. It's still a good read, and it's very sad. And I will say that this book is quite depressing and sad pretty much through the entire runtime. Shockingly so. You know, you think like, well, a book that was written in the early 1800s, like how intense can it be compared to something now? It's pretty depressing. So, very much so. So I'm glad I read it, and it is a really, really solid book. But yeah, wow, it was a heavy one. Next on the 4-star list is a newer book called Between Two Fires by Christopher Beelman. You see this talked about once in a while, actually quite a bit. It's pretty popular. It's a dark fantasy horror novel, and if I could compare this to anything what this book is like, it's as if Dark Souls was novelized. It just has the feel of Dark Souls, that really dark, very violent, unforgiving fantasy. And that's what it is. It's just a fallen knight taking a younger girl and a drunken priest along with him across France during the Black Plague, which I believe is the 1300s. So you got that going on. There's a huge religious angle to this book as well that is woven in quite well. And this is kind of a road novel. It's a lot of the characters. It's kind of picaresque to a degree. Like the characters are just, every chapter is episodic in their adventure. And it's just really entertaining. It's also quite funny. It's crude at times and funny. It gets a little grating with the it's hard to explain the dark medieval humor in the book that Beelman uses is overused a bit, I feel, and it's like, okay, I've heard that joke a million times. It's not funny anymore, but it's still entertaining, and it has a really cool ending to it and everything. But the dark fantasy elements to it are really solid. I'm not really into that stuff, but I do like Dark Souls, and there are some creature designs in here that are fucking awesome, basically. I mean, there's no other way to put it. There are just some really cool things in here. So I really recommend this. I think this is a great book. And I think this is, from what people have told me, it's one of his darker books. He has some more lighthearted, funny stuff, but a lot of people recommend a book called Black Tongue Thief to me. So I'd really like to go and read that one. But I highly recommend Between Two Fires if you want a dark fantasy book that does verge on horror at times. There's some pretty intense shit in here. He doesn't really shy away from doing whatever he wants to do, but he doesn't do it to an excess where it becomes kind of like some sort of gory gorehound fest book. So it's a really good book, and the writing is pretty damn good. It's not amazing, but it's pretty solid. He's a really good writer, and I feel like he's a really tiny author. Like, I know he does a lot in the Renaissance Fair circuit, but then when I ordered this book, the paperback I got was like one of those self-published kind of crappy style paperbacks. So I think this is like a self-published thing or a really small publisher. And I'm surprised because the writing on here, this should be in the store, and this needs a bit of a better release. It needs a better quality physical release, I think, because it's very, very, very good. So yeah, Between Two Fires, one of the cooler, most surprising books I've read this year that I really recommend. The next book on our 4-star list is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. This is a non-fiction book. David Grann is a phenomenal journalist, and I'm sure you've heard of the movie that has now come out with Leo DiCaprio and the other. I can't think. Sorry, but yeah, you know what I'm talking about. This is a really good book about something that happened early in the 1900s of a lot of murders that were taking place because the Osage Native Americans had a lot of oil on their land, and people were marrying into the family and straight up killing these people so they could take control of that oil money. And it goes so much deeper than that. It's very intense, and it's a very interesting story. It's of course a very important story that you think you should know about this, but you don't. It's one of those things. Graham does a lot of investigative journalism in this. Most of the book, all of it is his investigative journalism. But when you get to the end of the book, you start getting into the modern times, and he starts detailing some stuff he's doing in the present, and it opens up a whole other thing. It's pretty crazy. So this is really top-notch journalism, and I'd really like to read more of Graham's books because I don't think you see stuff like this very often with that much effort put into it. So it's definitely, if you want to read a nonfiction book, I really recommend this. And I haven't seen the movie yet, but I heard it's quite good, so I'd be interested in checking it out. And then the next book on this 4-star list, yeah, there's a lot of 4 stars, like I said, is Revival by Stephen King, which I think came out in 2014. I love King, and he got me into reading, as an adult, really, or as a teenager. Actually, as a matter of fact, I think I started reading him in middle school, so way far back. But King's super hit or miss for me. He writes a lot of shitty books, especially his newer stuff is I don't find to be very good. But of course, he has some great books. And Revival I read. I think Revival might have been a trunk novel for him. I'm not sure exactly, but I think it was an older one he had worked on and came back to. And he also took a lot longer to finish it than he does most books, and that might have had something to do with it. But it's kind of like I mentioned in my review, like a view into the life of a character. You follow this character from childhood all the way to adulthood and into late adulthood, and you see his whole life and the struggles he goes through. He has a bit of a rough life. And the one consistent factor is this religious preacher that he meets as a kid. And he keeps running into him throughout this book, throughout his life. And this preacher has this crazy idea of this thing that he's trying to do. This book is really a solid read. This to me feels like when I read this, it's like, this is why I like Stephen King, because this isn't like a masterpiece of literature, but it is such a good book. It's such a damn good, like, campfire story book. It's well written, it's funny, it's engaging, and it has the greatest ending he's ever written. I thought about this, the ending of this book when I read it, it blew my fucking mind. And I thought about it a lot, like, is this the best ending he's written? And I think it is. The ending of this is insane. I'm certainly not going to spoil it, but it's like, this takes some balls to write an ending like this, I'll say. First off, in just the insanity that the ending is, but secondly, because it's like, This is the kind of ending that can definitely alienate an audience and piss people off, and he just didn't care and went and wrote it. By far one of the best endings he's ever written. I think the best, and it really did blow my mind, and it makes you think about the book in a different way, and that's a very tricky thing to do as an author without it feeling cheap, like a little like, oh, I pulled the rug out from under you with a little cheap tactic. To me, it doesn't feel like that because it is built up quite a bit, and like you go back and read stuff and you're like, holy shit, he foreshadowed this very well, but I just wasn't paying attention to that. Everything kind of makes sense at the end. So wow, it's a good one, man. It's definitely one of his darker books, I'll say. Of course, it has humorous moments in it, and it has plenty of lighthearted stuff, as King often does in his books, but it is very, very dark at times. So just be warned that it's one of his more, I think, mature, dark works. I think it might very well be the most mature work he's written. So Revival is a great Stephen King book. I really recommend it. Next, real quick, is another 4-star, a little novella called Sakulina by Philip Fracassi. He's written another book that just came out called Gothic that looks interesting. I've just seen his name around and stuff. Some people said he writes like Stephen King, and I didn't get that from this. He has pretty good writing style, but nothing felt like King to me in here. This was like a cosmic horror, weird fiction kind of book about a guy and his dad and his friends that go out on a fishing trip. They get stranded in the middle of the ocean, and something weird starts happening to them. It's really a pretty solid read. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and it does what it needs to do, and the way that it explores things, I think that it's done pretty well. It doesn't go very deep into things because of the running time, but he doesn't try to force things down your throat because of the running time. So it's a really fun, good, weird fiction, cosmic horror kind of thing. And I liked it, and I haven't read any of Philip Fracassi's work since. I'm not sure why. I really would like to get in and read his stuff. So yeah, I recommend this. It's a quick read. It's like 90 pages, and it was a cool one. And the next two, I'll just put them on here as two, Harry Potter 1 and 2. I guess I shouldn't really include these because they're rereads. I've read these books a million times, but I haven't read them in a very long time, and I was going to just reread the whole series this year, and I kind of stopped after the fourth one just because other books got in the way. But, after rereading these, I like the first two less than I ever have because they definitely feel, of course, none of the Harry Potter books are adult fiction, but the first two specifically really feel like kids' books, children's literature. So I see the flaws in Rowling's writing. She's not the greatest author. She has a lot of plot holes in her books and stuff like that. But, they are intended for children. And these two they didn't do it for me like they used to. So, I just felt the need to include them on here. I still enjoyed them, though. Let's get on to the 4.5 star ones. These are the really great books I read this year. These are separate than the 5 stars. Those are going to be the monsters, right? But these are great books. Some of the best I read this year. So I'm really excited to talk about all these. And by the way, as a quick addendum, if you're still here, that's amazing. This is a really long video. I don't know if YouTube's going to auto put in chapters. I don't know if it still does that, but that would be cool. If not, though, I may go in and do that for you. But thanks for watching. I just wanted to say I really do appreciate it. This was the video I was most excited to make. So yeah. So anyways, just a little aside, just wanted to say that. Let's get on to the 4.5 star books. The first 4.5 star book on here is The Exorcist by Willem Peter Blatty. I read this at the beginning of October for Spooky Month, of course, and I read this book in one sitting. It was very, very gripping. Now, I will say, this is basically like the movie. It's very close to the film. And I really like The Exorcist movie. I love it. It's a classic. I don't find it particularly scary at all, but I think it's a great film. And it is a shame what has happened recently with the 4K release being not that great in very many respects, but that's a different story for a different video. But this was great to read. If you do really like the movie and you've never read the book, it's a very great read. It's very similar and you'll feel at home. Of course, the book has a little bit more going on than the movie, but surprisingly not too much more. The only difference I can say here is that the book is much more ambiguous about what's going on. There's more of a psychological aspect to the book that goes a little more into, is this really happening, or is it because of some issues this kid has in her life that are brought up near the beginning of the book? And it really makes you think. It's really not till the end of the book where it kind of is like, okay, this is like really happening. And that's a bit weird that he wrote it like that. And there's also a couple things in here that weren't that great, like the police character, who's kind of like comic relief, is okay, but overall this book is really smoking good. It's just so solid. When I read this, it's like, this is just such a perfect like package of a book. It's really has the scary moments and the humor and the psychological aspect. And the biggest thing is as we're getting into these books that are higher up on the list, is the technical writing ability, the prose. It's extremely well written. It's just, when I read books that have great prose, and everybody reads books for different reasons. A lot of people read it just for the story. I read it, of course, I like a good story, but I mostly read for the prose and the writing, because there are a lot of books that are kind of plotless that I love because the writing is so good. And you can kind of tell within the first like couple pages like what that's going to be like, And when I started reading this first chapter, which kind of opens similarly to how the film does, you just know you're in good hands because it's written so maturely and so well. I just really, really like this. There's a sequel to this called Legion. Folks tend to be a little more mixed on, but I am certainly going to check it out and read it. And I would like to read other books that this author has written, because Blatty's just seems to me to be a great author. So yeah, that's The Exorcist, a great, super good read. The next book on this list, 4.5 stars, is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which many would be consider to be a modern classic, and some say it's the quintessential American horror novel. I would not consider this a horror novel in the traditional sense. There are magical realism elements in this book, but those aren't the horrifying things. It is the horrors of slavery. This book follows a former slave person who has a child, a teenage child, and she's dealing with a child that she lost as a baby. And it's a really sad book and really depressing, but it is very powerful, and the way it makes you think about things. Toni Morrison's prose is exceptional. I get it now from reading this. Her writing ability is unbelievable. There were many times I had to just put this book down because I was like almost overwhelmed by how good of an author she was. Here's what I'm going to say about this. This is an extremely hard book. For me, this was a very difficult book to read. I read quite quickly. I don't try to get through a book as fast as possible. I feel I just naturally read quickly. So a 300-page book I can probably finish in 2 or 3 days. And this book took me about 2 weeks of consistent reading, because it is very hard to follow at times. And perhaps sometimes that may be where some qualms come into the book. It's just, I'm not sure what she's trying to do. It's very experimental. There are parts of this book that are written in like free verse poems that come out of nowhere. There are lots of flashbacks, and characters will daydream or tell a story, and it just kind of goes into it, and so there are a lot of moments in this book where I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I don't even know who's speaking right now. What? Because a lot of what she does is told through simile and symbolism. So you're not even sure at times, is this symbolic or is this really happening? And if it is symbolic, I'm not sure what the symbol is. So it's difficult, but I got along with the style as I went through it. It took me quite a while to get on with her writing style, and I would be lying if I said I understood everything that happened in this book, but I came out of it like, damn, this is a layered book. This is a book that you could discuss the rest of your life. And the way that she ends the book kind of flips things on its head and makes you want to go back and read things. And this book certainly warrants rereads. I think you could definitely pull stuff out of this, but I understand why this isn't for everybody, because it's quite a challenging read. To even get through the first chapter at times was like, wow, this is going to be a tough one. But I just couldn't stop thinking about it when I finished it. It was really profound. So that's why I'm putting it up here really high. The next book on this 4.5 star list is Blindsight by Peter Watts, which I have talked about to death on this channel, and I highly recommend it. This is one of the books that I just think about the most this year. It's a hard sci-fi book about a first encounter story, and it's written so intelligently. It is very cerebral, and it is also a difficult book. It's intentionally so in the way that things can be confusing because of some thematic elements that reveal themselves later on, but it can be hard. A lot of times in hard science fiction novels, you have a lot of technical terms. I find a lot of times in these kind of books, though I don't, granted, have a ton of experience with hard sci-fi, it's kind of set dressing a lot of times, or the context is given to you, or you can just go look it up quickly and you have that much more understanding of what's going on. And there is a lot of sci-fi jargon in here, but I didn't find that it was really that hard. Certainly not a book for everybody the way it's written. It's very clinical and cold, and in a different way than a book like Annihilation. This book is very, very clinical, and it's very cerebral. But first off, you have a very good first encounter story, which is excellent, and it's very gripping. But you just have so many brilliant themes in here that you don't see authors talking about, and they're presented in a way that is respects your intelligence. They're not handed to you on a silver platter, but they're not too obtuse to where you're not even sure what he's talking about. So I really, really liked this book. It was definitely not something I would normally read, but it really hooked me. I do like space and space exploration and stuff, but I'm not much of a sci-fi person. But Blindsight was something else, man. It really was one of the best books I've read this year, really ever. It was really a intelligent book. I have a whole review of it on my channel if you'd like more info. But if you want something that's a bit challenging, that will make you think about a lot of unique concepts you would normally not think about, and a really just cool first contact story with aliens, then check it out. It's a really unique book. The next book is The Deluge by Stephen Markley. Stephen Markley also wrote a book called Ohio, which I have not read, but I'm going to get to. The Deluge was really, really excellent. It was a climate change novel. It was political at times, and it showed a lot of different political viewpoints, which I thought was cool, and showed the pros and cons of everything. And it definitely leaned more to the liberal side of things, but didn't try to push any particular direction. And the climate change stuff was very interesting, and you could tell that a lot of research was put into this book. And I kind of said it in my initial review of this, that like this book is basically for not for people that don't believe in climate change. I don't think that people like that would get anything out of this, but maybe, but probably not. But it was definitely scary in this dystopian, like, holy shit, this could possibly happen kind of thing. And it didn't really feel like it was that crazy. It wasn't like, oh, the earth is going to just blow up. No, it was like, no, we'll have a devastating flood that will kill 300,000 people maybe, which is not a tremendous amount, but is a scary amount. And things like that happening, and how the government deals with that sort of thing or doesn't deal with it, and what can kind of come with that. And it was a multiple POV novel. It had a lot of different characters you follow that all sort of start to cross paths as the book goes on. And this book just gave you a lot of everything. It had political stuff, perhaps maybe a little bit too much of like policy discussion, I feel, and I think a lot of other people felt like that, but not a big deal. It had the climate stuff that was interesting, and it had like disaster movie-esque elements that came from that. It had a lot of humor, and in the fact that this was a 900-page novel, there was a lot of times where you could get to know these characters very well. These characters were very, very well developed in here. And due to the running time, he was able to have some moments that were just like very humbling sort of slice of life moments in here, and stories the characters would tell that weren't necessarily related story-wise to the rest of the book, that I like when authors can take the time and work that in. And so, yeah, this book was great. And I will say I read very quickly. 900 pages is quite a read, but it really flew by. I read it in about a week. It was just a really good book. I'd love to see what Markley does next. Next on the 4.5 star book list is Bubblegum by Adam Levin, the wackiest book I read this year. Even wackier than Broom of the System, which was super wacky. Cat's Cradle was wacky too, but in a different way. Bubblegum is a postmodern book written by Adam Levin, who's a modern author. And some people said that he writes like David Foster Wallace, and I do see that in the book. And I thought this book was excellent. And yeah, those kind of claims are kind of marketing claims to me, but I have to kind of agree with that. I feel like we're kind of in good hands with this guy. I haven't read his other stuff, but this was okay. This book is super not for everybody. It is postmodern through and through. It's about like an alternative like present when the internet doesn't exist, and everybody has these like little robot cutesy companions like pets. But they initially started as a sort of therapy thing for troubled kids, and kind of through, I guess you could say, like capitalism or just businesses kind of like filtering that out, turn it into more of like a little product, and people tend to treat them very poorly. And there's a lot of kind of stuff like that. This book is very like weird, and Levin's humor I liked, but he goes on tangents a lot. That's his style. He writes things sometimes I would read and I liked and found funny, but I'm like, oh my god, you can do that in a book. You can write like that. So they're just things that you might read and be like, what the fuck, but I appreciated that this guy said, I'm going to write whatever fucking book I want to. And that's what I'm going to do. I appreciated that. And, this book, you never will see where it's coming because it's basically plotless. You meet these characters, you get into things, but you just never can tell where it's going. And I do think that it does overstay its welcome sometimes, particularly the middle of the book breaks away from the plot, and you're basically reading almost like a thesis paper or a dissertation, and like tons of articles and transcriptions and things like that. And you're even reading like user manuals and stuff. That goes on for almost 200 pages. And I get what he was trying to do. He was trying to hammer in this point to you by doing that. But I felt like that part of the book went on way too long. It was like, I get it, man. I get it. And you just have to keep reading. And I get it though, but it just was really good. And, and the just totally batshit insane and wackiness and humor and everything. There are really sad, moving moments in this book. And that's where Levin's really high level technical writing comes through. And I will say that, for this like very clear postmodern novel, that those books tend to like never really wrap anything up. This book wrapped things up quite well and had a very nice, touching ending that I was completely not expecting. Going into this and reading it and committing to about 700 pages or so this book was, I was anticipating that this was not going to really end with anything, which I was okay with, but it did. So this would be a hard recommend for some people. I don't mean this in a condescending way, but I honestly think most people will not be able to get through 10 pages of this, and I truly mean that. It's almost like Levin front-loaded the first chapter to like weed out who was going to want to read this kind of thing, because the first chapter has like two dudes arguing about what word is going to go on a t-shirt for like 5 pages. It's that sort of thing. But there's just a lot of genius stuff in here, really, and it's very satirical at times too. So it is just like a super unique book, really cool, and I really want to read his other stuff. The next 4.5 star read on this list is It by Stephen King, which I've read another time. The first time I read it, I actually listened to the audiobook as well as while I was reading, which is performed by Steven Weber from Wings. One of the best audiobooks ever. I mean, this book is over 1,000 pages. It's about 1,157 or so pages. The audiobook's like 60 hours, and Weber gives an unbelievable performance. Seriously, like, if you don't want to read this and you want to listen to the audiobook, do it. It is super good. I just had to say that. An unbelievable, amazing performance from Weber. But I love this book. It is messy. It is very overly long. And it has a bit of a weird ending. But I really like it because this is Stephen King shooting for the moon, like going past the moon, right? He's trying to exit the galaxy with this book, and I appreciated that. This is King, and granted, he was probably like fucked up on cocaine writing this, and you can kind of tell, but it's just like, I don't think King will ever write anything like this, and I don't think he did. I even find The Stand to be more cohesive than this book. Not that this book is like incoherent or anything, more of a tight book. This book is, we all know what it is about, but this book really focuses on the characters coming of age, and also the characters as an adults coming to grips with certain things. And the majority of the text is not really horror based or scary, and it's a lot of that kind of stuff, which I do find King does the best, which is why I like this. And you just get a million stories in here. It's really more of like a short story collection that has like this overarching theme that all you have these two main plots that come together that are overarching the main bulk of the book, which is a lot of really good short stories. And so it's not, crazy experimental, but it's definitely experimental for King. And I just don't think he has anything else like this. And I like about 95% of the book really well. The ending's not terrible, but yeah, it's like not great. I see what he was trying to do, but I think he did it better in other books. But yeah, it is a great book. I love it, and I'll certainly read it again. Next book on this 4.5 star list is Norwood by Charles Portis, which I read, I think, last month, actually. And I also read True Grit by Charles Portis. But man, Norwood is so funny, and it's just so good. I recommend this to everybody. It is a road novel. It's a picaresque story. It's very short. It's about 100 pages. It's about a guy named Norwood traveling across the country to get $70 owed to him by his friend who did some work on his truck, I believe, or something like that. And it's just following this guy along the road. Every chapter, he meets a new crazy character and gets himself in a situation. Portis is the master of dry humor. This book is dry and really funny. And as I mentioned in my review for this, it is consistently funny. It is actually funnier than True Grit. It is just so funny. Every single page of this book has a joke on it. And like I said in my review, it doesn't get tiring. It never tires because it's so funny. And it's so well written. He puts a spotlight on this time period and this place, even though this book was written during that time period. But he's so good at like knowing like how these cultures work and like how they speak and where the humor comes from, and sometimes pointing out the flaws in them. It's an absolutely hysterical book that had me laughing out loud. I highly recommend it. It is really funny. I just didn't put it as high up because, well, spoilers, but True Grit's going to go up higher because that was just like an epic book. But Norwood is just a great, funny read. So yeah, let's get on to the 5 stars. These are the best of the best. There's not as many, but man, these are the best books I read this year. We'll start off with The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This book is very quick. It's 200 pages, and the text is double spaced. It has this desolate feel to the text. The book is very unassuming. It's about a guy and his son that are just trying to make it in a post-apocalyptic sort of America. We don't know what happened or why. We're not giving any context, and we don't need to. It is a slice of life book just showing these people walking down a road trying to make it with some philosophy thrown in. It's excellent. It doesn't overstay its welcome. The writing in here, not much needs to be said. It's Cormac McCarthy. It's like reading poetry. It's beautiful. It is beautiful desolation. This book is a very cold, desolate feel to it. It's very depressing at times. It's very hard to read at times, but it's so beautifully written. Like a lot of these books, plot-wise, there's not much to be said. It's more just a series of events, but it's done in a good way where you can't really see what's coming, but it doesn't feel like it's directionless, like McCarthy didn't know where to go with it. It's just wonderful. It really is. And because of the short nature of the book, it's one that's easy to come back to and reread. And of course, with books like this, you will always get more out of it afterwards. There's a million quotable things in here because of the writing. It's just a really, really good book. I was very, very pleased with reading it. It's definitely a 5-star read. I can find no faults in it. I don't know who wouldn't like this. Anyone that doesn't like McCarthy's style, of course. It's very poetic. His language is very flowery. He doesn't use much punctuation. He uses no quotations for speakers. I found from McCarthy, you don't need quotations because it's very clear who's speaking by the way he writes the books, but that's just me. But yeah, The Road, not much more needs to be said. It's absolutely fantastic. The next 5-star read is Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Besterica, which came out a couple years ago. I read this earlier this year, and this was absolutely wonderful. It's a short novella about a dystopian sort of future, or maybe a dystopian present, in which all meat has become poisonous to humans. So the factory farming of humans for meat has now become legal. And we follow a character who is involved in some way in that industry. This book is so good. I thought the writing was very mature and excellent. And much like a lot of these shorter books, I feel it's so good because how much is packed into the running time that is not overdone. Everything is just enough for this running time. You have excellent side stories and characters. You wouldn't expect a lot of side plots in a book this short. It's about, like I said, maybe 200 pages. But there you have it. It's there. And you have these wonderful side plots. That are just wonderfully mixed into the story, some running themes that are through our character. And, you know, it's a book about factory farming of humans. You get some gory moments in it that are just enough to scratch the itch, but not be like disgustingly gross out for the book. Although I will say, like, if you're squeamish, you won't want to read this. There are some really grody things in it, but it's not overt, you know what I mean? And it had a amazing ending that is really super well done. That one of those endings that just makes you go back and want to reread it because it changes the way you looked at everything. So this was just amazing. One book that I was a little skeptical on, because, you know, you see people hyping it up, and you at least me, I always get a little worried about that, but this was totally worth it. It's worth the hype. It was an absolutely phenomenal book. I don't know of what else this author has written, but I would be interested in checking out her other stuff. But I highly recommend Tender is the Flesh. It is a quick read. It's not super difficult to read, but it's got all the things you would want in a well-written book. So yeah, definitely recommend this one. The next 5-star read on this book is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I read this while I was camping, actually. I read almost the whole thing while I was camping. So that was cool to read this by the fire in the dark in the middle of the woods. And I don't think this would be a 5-star read for everybody because, admittedly, it can get a little boring in the middle. And I don't think this book is consistently scary. I don't know, it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be a terrifying, shit-your-pants kind of scare factor book to be a great horror novel. But the beginning sections of the book where Jonathan is in the castle, that tends to be people's favorite stuff. It is kind of creepy. I actually found later in the book the stuff with... Lucy, the character Lucy, and I'm spoiling this one, but this book came out like 150 years ago or whatever, or 125 years ago, that when she begins to turn into a vampire, I actually found that stuff a bit more freaky. The book is definitely like long in the tooth sometimes in the middle section where like they're doing these blood transfusion things. Like they need to give the character Lucy a blood transfusion so she doesn't like turn into a vampire, and they do it and it doesn't work, so they do it again. And I feel like they do that 5 times and it's like, what is happening? So that was kind of funny. And the character of Van Helsing, people sometimes poke fun at because he had some kind of like, I think maybe unintentionally funny moments, but it didn't really matter. Like I found him a very funny, cool, fun character. Sometimes it was like, wow, he like just like knows everything and will not explain it to the characters. But I just loved it. It was just such a fucking awesome book that I would love to read again. I did start reading this in high school, and I found it a bit boring at the time, so I kind of stopped once I got past the castle sections, and I'm glad I came back to it because now it's like the total package for me. So yeah, I think of all the books on my 5-star list, this is the one people wouldn't love the most. But yeah, it was really good. So Dracula. Next, we have True Grit by Charles Portis, which, as I mentioned, I read before Norwood, which are both superb books. But True Grit is kind of like a Western, or even in some ways an anti-Western. Though I guess time-wise, it takes place a little before when anti-Westerns would. It doesn't really matter, but basically a revenge story of the girl Maddie Ross, who's going to seek revenge for her father's killer. And, she teams up with Rooster Cogburn, I believe a marshal, and they and another character, and they... Basically, it's a road journey of trying to figure out, find this guy and seek revenge. And it's incredibly funny. It's also incredibly moving at times, and I just put this one up a little higher because there's nothing I dislike about this. The trademark Portis dry humor is here. Maddie Ross is such a good character. She's flawed. All the characters are flawed in here, which I love, but they also have very good qualities to them. They're very dry and funny. There's so many funny moments in here, but there's also amazing action Western moments in here as well. And it just feels epic in scope, even though the story is kind of small. This is almost in ways like an ultimate book for me. It's just so well put together and written and excellent. It has a great ending, and it is a quick read too. It's like 150 pages or so, and I recommend True Grit to everybody. Even if you don't think you're a big Western person, I still recommend it because the way that it's written is so engaging. I've never seen the old movie with John Wayne, but I did see the film with Jeff Bridges with I can't remember who else was in it, but the Coen brothers did that, and I thought that was an excellent adaptation. I thought that it captured the humor quite well, although I think that was a little bit funnier in the book, but the humor was captured well, and it was, of course, it's the Coen brothers, it's shot quite well, and it was just an overall excellent film. I thought that the girl that played Maddie Ross was okay, but she was pretty good. But yeah, it's a good movie I recommend checking out. True Grit, 5 stars. Really, really good book, a lifetime book for me. The next 5-star book on here, which might be one of the most surprising ones. It's not a bad book, but it's The Ruins by Scott Smith. Certainly one I would never have thought would be like a 5-star read, but I loved it. I really did. It's like a book about some young 20-somethings that go to Mexico and get stuck on these ruins, and they can't leave because of some sort of environmental factor there that's keeping them there. And it becomes kind of a one-location story, which I always really like. And the book is definitely a character study, but it has plenty of tense moments. And it kind of, in some ways, has that characters breaking down and turning on each other kind of vibe, but you also are dealing with this thing that's coming after them, and I found it to be a really good book. I thought this was going to be like a nice, fun, quick and easy, like pulpy book, and I feel like it really has a lot more literary value than that. I think it's quite well written, and as a matter of fact, it has a sort of a cold sort of prose to it that I thought was really good. And Smith just spent a lot of time on character development. There's a movie of this that throws all that shit out the window. The movie's not very good. It's okay. It's worth watching, but it's not really a great film. And it changes some certain things unnecessarily so. But the book has a lot of time for character development. So you do get a lot of like backstory to the characters who at the beginning are a little bit cookie cutter, but you start to see as the book goes on, their personalities divulge. And even from that sort of stuff, just the more pulpy action story-oriented moments are just really good. And so I thought about this one a lot, like what I put, of course my ratings don't really matter, but I just found after reading this that I don't know, there's something about this book is cruel, it doesn't pull any punches. It just doesn't, it's one of those books written like that where it's like, it doesn't care. It's just going to do what it does. And I really liked it. And I think most people would probably enjoy this if you like horror stuff, want single location stories. I think this is a pretty easy recommendation. I don't think it would be everybody's 5-star read. But for me, it just hit the spot really well. It's something that I'm already wanting to go back and read, and I already read it this year, so that's kind of a good sign. Smith also has another book. He's only written 2 books, to my knowledge, called A Simple Plan, which I don't think is a horror novel, but I hear that book highly recommended all the time, so I'll definitely be checking out A Simple Plan by Scott Smith. But The Ruins, an awesome book, a really good book that hits the spot, and it can be kind of gross sometimes too. It has a lot of chilling moments too, and I just really loved it. So, with that being said, we have 2 more books on this list, and these are the 2 best books I read this year. These are actually the 2 best books I've ever read. So here they go. In no particular order because they're both equal. The first one is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I've read this book one other time, but I feel like I read this in high school, and I think it was over my head, and I might have not even finished it. So I feel like I read it for the first time, kind of. It reminds me of It's kind of that Western. I dare say picaresque, because picaresque often has a humorous sort of lighthearted feel. But just like a book that's about the life like slice of life, like you're just following these characters on their adventures. Every chapter is just a new sort of predicament they get themselves in. So it's plotless in some ways where you can't always tell where it's going. And you have now you have your typical Cormac McCarthy poetic sort of prose, which is much more dense here than it is in The Road. The Road isn't necessarily a super easy book to read, but I think it's much more accessible than this. This book gets very, very dense with the poetic language at times, to where you have just page-long paragraphs of poetic sentences. I'm not saying that as a negative. I thought it was absolutely beautiful and shocking at times. Like I was arrested by the language in this book often. I mean, I legitimately had to put the book down so I could think about things and then go back and reread it, because it was just so unbelievably striking and well written. But also, it's just so entertaining. A lot of people say this book is really hard to read. I will agree, it's a hard read. Due to the language that's used, due to the violence. It is an incredibly graphic novel. I don't mean that lightly. I mean, there's like really disturbing things that happen in this book. So just be warned, if you want to pick it up and you're squeamish or you struggle with just cruelty and violence, it's what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't stray away from anything, and it likes very much so, McCarthy in this book, to put that violence in your face to show you what it was like, the senselessness of it, by making it as gratuitous as it is. And, in reading this, some of the more violent passages in the book that, to me, a gorehound, I was like, Jesus Christ. That's probably a tenth of what really occurred. And a lot of this book is based on true events. So that's a bit frightening, but it's just really entertaining too. There's so many like adventures and great scenes. And of course, the character, the judge, right? He is the best villain of all time, I feel. And I remember when I went to reread this, because like I said, I really remembered very little of it. And, hearing everybody say the judge is just the best, the best villain. I didn't get that at first. I thought he's a great character and he's well written, but he's so aloof. And then as the book goes on, you really start to see, you see that the judge is like out of the book. The judge is this like metaphysical character that's almost outside the pages of this book, as if in some ways the judge is like in on us with the joke that we're reading a book, while these other characters are just kind of like at his whim because they're in the book and they can't control their own destiny in a way. I mean, maybe that's like looking into it too much, but that's how I saw it. And, this book, of course, is littered with symbolism everywhere, and it's very interesting to think about. And so to me, this book is infinitely rereadable because of the gorgeous language, but also just, I felt like the story was great. As I was saying, people find this book very difficult to read, and I do understand that, but I felt like I hear a lot of people say it's very, very confusing and they're not sure what's going on. And personally, I didn't really get that. I mean, like I've said before, I find McCarthy's very good at letting you know who's speaking without quotation marks. And granted, there are some moments that were a little bit confusing, but overall, I didn't really think it was that hard to follow. I thought it was pretty clear most of the time. It was really excellently written and engaging, and I felt like almost every chapter had something that just wanted me to keep reading. I really had a hard time putting this book down despite the graphic content. And I mean, like, I've already said it, but like, there's like violence on nearly every page of this book. That was a big thing I, remembered and was, I heard going into it. And it's like, yeah, it is like crazy violent. It may be one of the most violent books ever written, not counting, like a lot of like splatterpunk kind of stuff, but I could go on for another hour talking about Blood Meridian, but yeah, it's like the best book I've ever read. It's unbelievable. And yeah, I love that it was written. I love that I exist in a time period of Earth where I can read Blood Meridian. Let's get to my next book, which is also probably the best book I've ever written. You may know what it is. That book is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is a dark thriller. It's just unbelievable. Tartt's writing is often compared to like Charles Dickens or something like that. And I get that from her. She feels like she's almost writing out of a different time period. Her prose is superb. It is flowery, but not overly so or purple or anything. It's just her technical writing ability is superb. It is up there with the best. And I think she might be one of the best modern writers. And it's quite a shame that she only has 3 novels out. I get that she takes a long time to write her books, but I wish she was more prolific because her writing is so good. You know, I never feel when I read her stuff, and I'm currently reading her second book, that I just don't feel like worried. You know, even if the book doesn't go where I want it to, it doesn't really matter because I get to read her writing, which is, yeah. But the thing with The Secret History, which is why I think it's one of her more popular ones, and why I think I haven't finished The Little Friend, but I think people tend to not like it as much, is because The Secret History just also has a really thrilling plot. You know, I've seen some people say it's a little slow, maybe a little, but I don't know, not really. It's a very thrilling plot. It's a dark mystery, a murder mystery. It's got this, you know, it's just a great thriller, and it takes place in Vermont, and there's a lot of wintry aspects to the book at times, and it gives you that cool, isolated, cold feeling at times. And I thought the characters were excellent in this book. I really did think they were great, and I thought this book was phenomenal. I was super hooked on it. And it's another infinitely rereadable book. So yeah, I see why this is so popular, because the writing is superb, but it has a good story to keep you going. That's a really hard thing to do, to write a literary book that is so focused in the language and what she's trying to portray, but also make a plot that is so gripping you just can't stop reading. That's a tough thing to do. Maybe that's not exactly what she did in Little Friend, but I think she was going for, I'm not done, but going for a different sort of thing. But Little Friend so far is an excellent read. And as a matter of fact, we'll say just about 150 pages in or so, I think the writing is better in The Little Friend, but it certainly is phenomenal in Secret History. And that's it, man. An hour and 20 minutes is the longest video I've ever done, but there were 32 books I had to talk about. That's a lot of stuff, and like I said in the beginning, mostly good stuff, which is great. So yeah, if you've listened to this whole thing, well, that's pretty impressive that you did that, but yeah, let me know what your good stuff was, if you read any bad books, and if you read any of the stuff on this list. I know some folks have that have watched my stuff, but yeah. Hey, everybody, have a great year. I'll probably do one more video talking about some movie stuff, and that'll be it for this year. And I may get back to you if I finish any more books and do a little review or something like that. But yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching and all that, and have a great one. Peace out, everybody.